Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Bridging the Gap here on the Jersey First TV network. As you guys are aware, I'm AJ Malillo and I'm joined with my wonderful co-host,
Stephen Rombolo. How are we doing?
And we have another great guest for you in our sort of program that is designed to show you what Gen Zers are capable of getting out there, getting involved right now. We're joined with Mason Morgan of Run Gen Z. It's an organization that's built on getting Gen Zers, specifically Gen Z conservatives, out there running for elected office. And before we start this interview, I do want to say that we did reach out to a couple of organizations that do the same thing, but for liberal-minded individuals, democratic-minded individuals, and we just haven't heard back. But Mason and Run Gen Z did get back to us, so we're very happy to have them on. Thank you so much, Mason, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. I'm excited to participate today.
Yeah, I think that this is going to be a ton of fun, this interview, and I think that it's a great idea to show young people exactly the things that they can do to get involved. I think that's the biggest hurdle is like, oh, I'm 23 years old. What can I really do? So I guess that leads me to my first question, which would be, what is Run Gen Z? Like, who are you guys? What do you do? When did you start? Why? Give me the whole rundown of Run Gen Z.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Run Gen Z was officially filed back in August of 2020. And so I joined the team January 1st of 2021, kind of as our first full-time dedicated staff member to really help us move things forward. But to give you guys the background of the organization and kind of what we do, we were founded by a young guy named Joe Mitchell. He's from Mount Pleasant, Iowa. Joe and I got connected actually through fraternity recruitment when we were both in college. And so I was a junior when I met Joe. He was a freshman, and him and I kind of hit it off and became close friends and remained close friends throughout college. But after I had moved back to Texas and I was working for Senator Cornyn down here, one day I get a call from Joe, who was 20 at the time, and he tells me, hey, I'm going to run for the state house in Iowa, and I would love to have your support. And I'll be honest with you guys, and Joe doesn't let me forget this either, but I laughed him off. I was like, Joe, you're 20, you're a junior in college. Don't you need a degree before you go run for office? Like, I threw all of the questions at him that we're now trying to show young people that they ultimately don't matter. And so Joe didn't take very kindly to my initial reaction, as he should have. And a couple months later, he calls me back and tells me that he won. I kind of rub it in my face a little bit, as I deserved. But what Joe did was he went out and he did the hard work. He knocked on doors. He made phone calls whenever he wasn't doing his coursework at Drake University. And so he comes out of the primary winning by 100 votes. So it was a pretty slim margin. And he was in a pretty reliably red district. So he went on to win the general election with about 65% of the vote back in 2018, if I remember correctly. And so now being the youngest elected official or the youngest state representative in the history of Iowa, and one of the youngest in the country, Joe started to get invited to speak on a lot of panels, whether that was at Turning Point conferences or other legislative or more legislative focused groups. And he realized something that he was always kind of sharing the stage with these people that were, in some cases, 3, maybe 4 times his age as a 21-year-old, right? And so Joe started to think, well, what can we do to start empowering more young people to do it? I mean, I can tell you guys firsthand, Joe is not a 4.0 student. Joe is, he wasn't this anomaly who had the perfect resume or anything like that. Not to make a dumb pun here, but I mean, he was kind of just an average Joe that was willing to put in the hard work. And that was when this idea of Run Gen Z kind of started to take shape. And so he started thinking, well, what can I do? And he ends up meeting a young guy named Elliot Engen, who's actually a candidate this year for the Minnesota House of Representatives. And he met Elliot back in, I believe it was 2019. And when he was talking to Elliot after he spoke on a panel, he was telling Elliot, well, you seem like you'd be a great candidate. Why don't you go ahead and run for office? Of course, Elliot has every question in the book. Well, like, I want to be a prosecutor. I want to go to law school. I have all of these things I want to do. Don't I need like the picture perfect family for my door hangers and my push cards? I mean, all of these things that at the end of the day, I mean, Joe and I kind of call excuses at this point, because Joe ended up convincing Elliot to run. And so he ran against an incumbent Democrat. And after election day, he ended up only coming short by about 90 votes and almost flipped a seat from blue to red. And that would have been the 2020 cycle. And so Elliot's now running again this year. But Elliot's story and his relationship with Joe, after Joe convinced him to run, he was kind of informally mentoring Elliot. They would talk on the phone once a week, once every other week, just whether it was more of like an emotional support thing, like, man, I just had a really tough day today. Like, how did you get through these when you were first running? Other times it was like, Joe, I keep hearing these questions about the property taxes in my area. How do I craft an effective message to get my point across and to convey where I stand on that specific policy issue? And so that was when Run Gen Z was really born. And what Run Gen Z is and what we offer young people is a one-of-a-kind peer-to-peer mentorship, where when a young person applies to our website, we will actually work with them over the course of several months to conduct research on their area and the districts that they live in to help guide them towards a winnable, viable office. So I'm sure you guys could guess, we have a lot of 19 and 20-year-olds come up to us and they say, well, I want to run for governor. Or I want to be a congressman. And it's like, well, you got to be 25 to be a congressman, but go ahead and apply to our website. Let's start working with you now as a 20-year-old, and let's put you on a path to be a 25-year-old congressman, to be the next Kat Cammack or the next Madison Cawthorn, whatever it might be. And so that's really what Run Gen Z is. We empower these young people by sharing the story or the stories of the 46 elected officials we have involved with Run Gen Z as candidate mentors to empower them and show them that, look, you can be a 20-year-old and run for office. I mean, we've got some people that started running when they were 17 and were sworn in as 18-year-olds. Caleb Hanna, one of our co-founders, who's actually also the youngest African-American ever elected to a state office in U.S. history, went from student body president of his high school to state delegate in the West Virginia House. That was his immediate jump. There wasn't anything in between there. And so, yeah, that's kind of Run Gen Z, and we've been operating for about a year and a half. We've received about 4,500 signups from initial contacts with young conservatives interested in exploring the possibility of running. And we've received over 350 applications for our mentorship program.
I mean, it's just an incredible story of your organization. I think that it's an incredibly important one too. Young people, the biggest gripe I would say of our generation, I would say our generation's, Mason, because you're a couple years older than Stephen and I, but is that why are all of these old people running our country, right? They're not going to be around when we have to deal with all the consequences. And what you're showing is that, well, first of all, the old people don't have to be running the country because young people can run. It's enough with, like you said, enough with all the excuses. And second of all, it's like you have a proven track record that it works. And I think that is awesome. And so I'm not sure. I have another question, but I wanted to let Stephen jump in here and give his 2 cents quick.
Yeah, I mean, as somebody across the aisle, I have to give credit where credit is due. I think everything that you just said is remarkable, actually. And I would agree with AJ. I think the biggest gripe that I hear when I have conversations with my peers is, what are these old people doing? And I'm going to repeat what AJ said again. I even wrote it down on my little notes thing. You use the word excuses. And I think that perfectly encapsulates the way that our generation should be thinking about running for office, because we have an opportunity. We have so much momentum, especially in this era with, how social media savvy this generation is, to kind of break the mold of what a traditional candidate for a position looks like, which is super important for a Gen Z candidate. If you don't mind, AJ, can I fire off a question that's kind of relevant before you?
Of course.
So the only thing that jumps to my mind, and I think it's great that there's a lot of young people who want to run, like you said, 19, 20-year-olds who want to be Congress people, that you're setting up to be that 25-year-old congressperson. Does that concern you, though, that maybe these kids are getting set up to become the thing that they fear, these career politicians, by getting started so young? Is there a drawback to that?
So something that, and I've said this pretty frequently over the last year and a half. I mean, this term "career politicians," I think points more to a darker side of politics, right? The more opportunistic politicians that take advantage of their office. But I don't think there's anything wrong with a lifelong career in public service if you're doing it right. And that's one thing that I think this mentorship really adds to the development of these young candidates, is that we want these mentorship relationships to be very personal. We try to be fairly hands-off as far as over formalizing it. We really want these two people to become friends and lifelong friends that can, one, hold each other accountable as they continue to progress, but can also lean on each other once they're serving in office. And so one example from 2021, we had a successful candidate in Albany, Georgia. His name is Jalen Johnson. And his Run Gen Z mentor was a city councilman in Florida named Ebo Insua. And Jalen and Ebo had just, I mean, seeing them in person, like meet in person for the first time, was a real treat, because these guys had only ever talked over the phone. Ebo was successful in helping Jalen win his election and playing a small role in that success. But when they got together for the first time, it was like they'd been lifelong friends, like the two of y'all. I mean, there was just this back and forth that was electric to watch. And that's really what we want to do. And I think that's the number one way that we're kind of combating this negative view that people have of politicians right now, by trying to instill integrity in this next generation at a young age, so that they're not beholden to the special interests and all the things that you see going on in Washington.
Yeah, certainly. I think that the impact of instilling integrity and being accountable to other people and not special interests, like you just said, is so important. It's like another big gripe is like people are beholden to companies, big interests, things like that. But if you're beholden to other people, I think that that's really important too. And I think, Stephen, it looked like I wanted to add something. So.
Yeah, another thing that I'm kind of picking up on, and you correct me if it's a misjudgment here, but I think another great thing about the way that you're describing the function of this organization is that there's almost this sense of uniformity in what your candidates and these applicants are standing for, which to me is an incredible thing, because you hear a lot of discourse inter-party. Even there's inter-party discourse between people, in the Democratic Party that are, some would say, radical Democrats and moderate Democrats. And I think a great thing about the way that you're structuring this organization is that you're exposing candidates nationally to these mentors in other places, and it gives them an opportunity to kind of take and pull from what the politics and just the general political discourse in different parts of the country is. And it could be really unifying for the conservative ideology. Is that like an intended outcome of what you guys are doing, or is that something that you're kind of just picking up as a great benefit along the way?
And so as far as the intentionality behind that, the best way for me to answer that is something that we set out very early on to kind of foster the atmosphere and the environment of Run Gen Z, was to take a very big tent approach to the conservative movement. And I think that under Joe's leadership and with my help and our new staff member, a young lady named Logan, who just came on about a couple of weeks ago, we've really towed this line. And so out of those 46 elected officials that we have in our organization, you've got your red meat MAGA Republicans, right? But we also have a lot of moderate Republicans. And when you get them all in the same room at one of the conferences or the events that we hold, there is this camaraderie just amongst a generational camaraderie that kind of goes past these partisan divides and even the divides that we're seeing within the parties right now. And so the only policy stances that Run Gen Z is going to take and kind of what, and I hate using this term, but like what our litmus test for candidates is like, if you want to limit the scope of government, if you want to lower taxes and make sure that you are taking home more of your hard-earned dollars at the end of your workday, and you want to make it easier for somebody to start and grow a business, you're going to be one of our Run Gen Z candidates, and we want to work with you. And that's a call to action to young people listening to this podcast. Look, if you want to limit that scope of government, if you want to make sure that you have more money at the end of the day than you're giving back to the government, we want to hear from you. We want to find some way for you to give back to your community and get involved in the public sector. One kind of a tangent here I'll go on is I think a lot of people see a lot of these positions as full-time jobs. That's simply not what it is. So Run Gen Z only works on the state and local level. We're hyper-focused on school boards, city councils, and state legislators. Here in Texas, the state legislator meets once every 2 years. And so, yeah, there's about I think it's about 100 days or so every 2 years that it's pretty hard to have a full-time job because you're in the state capitol working on legislation, participating in debates and committee hearings. But city councils, for instance, most of the time those meetings are once a month in the evenings at your city hall. And so all of the elected officials in our coalition, for the most part, have a full-time job outside of their elected office. And it certainly takes a level of maturity that I think some of our mentees and prospective candidates can earn or can achieve through this mentorship. Because it's being a 19-year-old and having to manage your schedule. I can tell you guys, I wasn't that responsible when I was 19. I couldn't have done it. But we've got a lot of 18, 19-year-olds who are the youngest elected officials in their state. Here in Texas, we have Roman Garcia, who's 20 years old, who's elected last year at 19 to the Kerrville, Texas City Council. And I mean, Roman is this phenomenal guy. When you talk to him, I mean, he could be 40 years old. He's very professional, very well put together. And it's very easy to forget a lot of times that he is 20, but that I think is a benefit that he has and something he can pass on to these other young conservatives that are ready to step up to the plate and take their next step from activist to candidate.
Yeah, Mason, as you're explaining all these things and the connections between people, it brings me back to something that I learned probably like my freshman year of college in my like American government class, which was basically that back in the day, politics was very local. It was very much you cared about who's going to be running in your local races more than your national races because because those are the people that had more tangible effect on it, and the national races kind of took a backseat. Obviously, the presidential election was still a big deal, Senate, and so forth, but the local elections mattered more. And then I would say that since the development of the 24/7 media, and then bigger than that, social media has connected all of these places, national politics have become this giant force to be reckoned with, and local politics have taken a back seat. And what I really admire about Run Gen Z is that you really don't focus on national politics at all. And you're really focused on the local politics. And something that Stephen said that made me think of this is that it's almost like you're connecting local politics together. So let's say somebody was running for a town council in New Jersey, you might connect that person with somebody from Texas, right? And say, well, sure, they ran in Texas, but look, they won the race. This is what people cared about in Texas. Let's see what works in Texas, what worked in Texas, see if that works in New Jersey, or what you can take from that race. And I think that that's so interesting. It's almost like locally connecting different parts of the nation. And I think that that's really awesome. That's a really awesome function of Run Gen Z. And I'm not sure Stephen has another question or something, but I did want to move on to talk a little bit about you, Mason, but I want Stephen to jump in if he has anything to add.
Yeah, the only thing I would say to kind of build off what AJ said is I think it's very admirable, because the picture that gets painted in my head is, you say you're not focusing on national politics, but in a way, I kind of see it as almost a collage where you're showing through this organization what the nation at its most local levels cares about, which is in a way a national attitude, what the people care about at home, not what the people care about at Washington. And I think that's something that a lot of Gen Zers can really get behind, because it is so easy, especially with social media, like we've been saying, to have a network of people in your immediate area to kind of dip your toes in it and get a sense of the climate there. And then to be able to have an organization like Run Gen Z that allows you to take those experiences and share it with people similarly poised in smaller neighborhoods and communities across the country is actually very remarkable. I'm kind of blown away right now by how awesome this organization is. And I'll be honest with you, as somebody on the left, what you're pitching here, aside from limiting the scope of government, lower taxes and more money at the end of the day, that's a platform I'd think about applying to get on.
Well, we'll get you there one day, Stephen.
That's what we've been saying for years. But Mason, my question to you is similar to the first question that I asked you, and that's, who are you? Because at the end of the day, Bridging the Gap is a show about people. And so we want to learn about the people that we have on. So I want to learn a little bit more about Mason and your story and journey into politics and how you got to where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I was born here in Dallas, Texas. My dad is actually Welsh. So he moved here back in the 80s from Wales and bounced around the country until he met my mom, who's at the time, it was a small town. It's no longer too small of a town. It's called Grand Prairie, Texas. It's kind of turned into a suburb of Dallas, and grew up here and graduated from high schools here in Texas. And AJ, as we were kind of talking about before the interview, was never super interested in politics. I remember thinking it was a lot of fun trying to run around in elementary school when we kind of did the straw polls for, I think it would have been the 2004 Bush-Kerry election. And a friend of mine and me and a friend of mine were kind of on opposite sides, seeing who could win. And so always enjoyed the competitive aspect of it, but didn't find much of an interest in government per se until my senior year of high school. I took a dual credit government class through a community college here. And I just really liked the professor, really resonated with me, and found it fascinating that we had developed a system of government where I go and I cast my vote to send somebody to a city that's hundreds of miles away. And then that person is going to cast votes to put into place laws that are going to affect how I live my day-to-day life. And so I decided that politics and government was kind of what I wanted to do in college. That took me up to Des Moines, Iowa, where I attended Drake University and got connected to Joe Mitchell. And while I was up at Drake, the Iowa caucuses were going on. And so, I mean, it was pretty easy to get involved. There were opportunities everywhere. And so the first kind of opportunity I had was somebody that actually worked for a PR firm approached me. And they said, hey, John Kasich is coming to speak from Des Moines. And I kind of want to know his response to this question. So I'm like, okay, yeah, I'd love to go see John Kasich. He's running for president. I mean, I was 19 at the time. I probably hadn't even, and this is probably the first politician I saw speak in person. And so I go and I look at my email, and she had sent me this, this gotcha question, right? Where she was definitely trying to trip up Kasich in some way. And so I very timidly raised my hand when he asked if there were any questions, and I'm very thankful to this day that he didn't call on me, because I was red in the face. I was like, this was not how I pictured my introduction to politics. But anyway, I kept going to some events as that heated up, and ended up interning with the Jeb Bush campaign, which, as you guys know, could have gone a little bit better than it did. But I always tell people I really appreciated the opportunity because it was a very traditionally run campaign as far as grassroots goes. And so I was kind of that intern that was constantly asking my teachers, hey, like I've got this campaign event, like I'm not going to make it to class. Like, can I just email you like a summary of the reading or something like that? And thankfully, my professors were very receptive to that, and appreciated that. I mean, the whole reason I was in Iowa was to do the Iowa caucuses. And so the campaign kind of took notice of that, that I was spending more time at the campaign headquarters than I was in my dorm or at my fraternity house, I guess, where I was living at the time. And they ended up offering me a regional director position on the campaign. So more of a full-time role with more responsibilities. And so I was in charge of organizing the 20 most rural counties in Iowa as a Texan that had only been in Iowa for about a year and a half. And I'll tell you, the most rural counties in Iowa, they're not really clumped together. They're kind of all over the state. And so it was a lot of driving. I had a two-wheel drive pickup truck at the time that did not do very well in snow. And so I stopped driving after a little while. I had a couple close calls. And so ultimately after that, ended up going to Nevada to help on the Jeb campaign before he ended his run, and moved back to Texas for a bit to work on a congressional race for now Congressman Jody Arrington. And then went back to Iowa to finish my degree. Had several other jobs there. The most notable one, I got to clerk for the Iowa Senate Majority Whip in a year that the Republicans had just taken back the majority in the Iowa Senate for the first time in, I think, 12 years. And so it was a lot of fun to see the momentum that everybody had after the 2016 election and some of the reforms that the Senate was able to get passed that year. But ultimately moved back to Texas because it was way too cold in Iowa for a Dallas boy, and worked for Senator Cornyn until I hopped over with Run Gen Z. And with the Senator's team, my first job was as a caseworker in one of his district offices here. And for those that don't know what a caseworker is, I essentially acted as a middleman between Texans facing difficulties with federal agencies and that federal agency. And so the two main agencies I dealt with on a daily basis were the Department of Veterans Affairs, which was work that I took a lot of pride in, helping veterans get the care that they rightfully deserve, whether that was their benefits or getting a change to a different primary care physician, whatever that might be. The other agency that I dealt with most often was the post office. And I will tell you guys, there were, I won't share any of the stories here, but I mean, there were some pretty interesting things that came out of the United States Postal Service, and the issues people would have with it. And then after the casework in 2018, we obviously had Beto O'Rourke running down here against Ted Cruz. Senator Cornyn likes to call him Robert Francis, which is his real name. And so nobody really knows where the Beto came from, if you ask people in Texas politics. But I saw what happened in that 2018 race and went to my bosses and essentially told them, look, my background is in political campaigns. I want to do what I can to make sure that Senator Cornyn gets reelected. How do I go about that? And so I transitioned from the official office to the campaign side of things and got to work on what was called the Texas Victory Campaign. It's kind of orchestrated by Senator Cornyn's team, where by the end of the campaign, we were more focused on state legislative races than we were the U.S. Senate race, because it was clear that Senator Cornyn wasn't going to have as close of a fight as some of these local people were. And proud to say that in the county that I oversaw, which was where the city of Dallas is, we held on to two incumbents in an ever trending blue county. And so it was a big win for us. But about 2 weeks after that campaign ended, Joe flew me up to Iowa and we started talking logistics for Run Gen Z.
Yeah, I think that's such a fun story, because I've worked a little bit in campaigns myself, and I will say I did not like it at all. So I think that it's so interesting when I come across people like yourself and a campaign manager that I had worked for who have a similar story where it's like they worked in the regular government office and they're like, this isn't for me, campaigns are for me. And I think that something you hearkened on earlier might, and you can agree or disagree, obviously, might play a role in this. I think that you said that you always enjoyed the competition of the campaigning, dating back to when you were in elementary school, and I think that that's a big thing. If you're a competitive person at heart, which I typically am, but for whatever reason, not when it comes to the campaigning, that's a big draw for a lot of people. Would you agree with that? Where it's like maybe former athletes are driven to politics and campaigning for that specific reason, that competition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can tell y'all, I'm running for precinct chair in my county right now, and have found myself in a contested race, which is far more contested than a precinct chair race should ever be. But I mean, there's a lot of truth to when people say that politics is kind of a blood sport. I mean, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of moving parts, there's a lot of trying to outmaneuver your opponent, things like that. And I think it does really attract more competitive people.
Yeah, for sure. Stephen, if you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I think the super interesting thing about you as an individual, Mason, that I find to be admirable is, so you're representing this organization that we talked about earlier, is, you know, focused on putting young people in office, in the positions. But you yourself are somebody who also contributes to government service in a less conventional way. Like you mentioned, you do a lot of organizing, your work as a caseworker, and now you're also running for an elected position yourself. So you've kind of like triple dipped in all of the ways that a local government functions, and you kind of are exemplary of the diversity of ways to get involved, which I think is a great strength for the organization to have somebody like you representing them. We should be very, very lucky to have you. So I want to follow that with a question and ask, what do you think, because you have experience in all three of these kind of avenues of service, what do you think is your greatest asset that makes you so functional and clearly successful in this kind of local service position?
Yeah, and so I think the best way for me to answer that is to kind of dive into me and Joe's dynamic. Because me and Joe, he was clerking for a senator at the same time that I was in the Iowa Senate. But if you would have told me I'd be working with Joe, let alone for Joe 5 years ago, I would have told you were crazy. Him and I were just buddies in college. And so when Joe approached me about Run Gen Z, I admittedly was fairly hesitant at first, as I hadn't even been sold on this idea that I am now 100% bought into, that young people have this invaluable viewpoint and outlook on life that government bodies can benefit from. But Joe is definitely very much a big picture idea kind of guy. And he kind of employs me to implement those ideas that he has. And so I think being able to work through logistics and come up with processes to make sure that we're tracking all of the metrics that we need to, as well as ensuring that our applicants and Run Gen Z trailblazers, as I call them, who are running for office, are getting the resources that they need from their mentors. And so definitely being able to put everything together or take a big picture idea and work out the mechanics of it, I think is my biggest, what I bring to the table.
Yeah. Sorry, Steve, you're good.
I was gonna say, so to kind of piggyback off that, then, would you say that the greatest asset that Gen Z possesses is what you were mentioning, this kind of invaluable worldview that is seemingly absent from our current government system?
Wait, Mason, sorry, before you answer that question, because Stephen just hit it on, I was going to ask a very similar question. Basically, what is, when you're looking at Gen Z and millennials, what are the biggest things that you see on top of that, even if you can delve into a little bit more millennials too, because they're also the young people running?
Yeah, and quickly I'll clarify. So we're Run Gen Z, right? But we work with people 18 to 30. And so we do work with some young millennials as well. Like I'm 26, to give you guys reference. Like I've always considered myself a millennial. And I think that was actually the first thing I said to Joe when he told me about Run Gen Z. He's like, I can't work for you. I'm not Gen Z. But um, I do think that people from the younger generation, and I think that this goes for people of any generation, they have these events that happen throughout their life that they give them a specific worldview. I mean, I remember having the internet growing up, right? I think one of the defining factors of like if you're Gen Z or not is if you remember where you were on 9/11 is something that people say a lot. And I mean, those different outlooks and worldviews, I think, offer new and different solutions to already existing problems that kind of, as we touched on earlier, the older generations that are currently running government simply haven't found a solution for. And we're still dealing with the national debt. And I mean, right now we're seeing this in crazy inflation. I mean, even here in Texas, I'm paying almost $4 a gallon for gas. And I think the young people, whether it's the right or the best solution, they have a different solution than what is currently being offered, and that's a voice that deserves to be heard. That's something that we say a lot with Run Gen Z, and kind of one of our slogans is, look, we're not only fighting to have a voice in these government bodies, but we're also demanding a seat at the table.
Yeah, I think that that's really interesting, and I saw a couple articles, obviously about the organization, and one thing that I noticed too was there is sort of a push for diversity, not just in outlook, not just in the youth, but also in pretty much any way you slice diversity. So, can you talk a little bit about the importance of diverse candidates for Run Gen Z in general too?
Absolutely. So, I mean, on the ideology side, I kind of touched on it earlier that we really toe this line and try to invite people of all shades on the conservative side of politics, right? But as far as diversity in ethnicity and kind of upbringing and those different things, I think it's important that we have a party and a movement that reflects the United States, right? We, Joe, I'll say rather, very intentionally built out our co-founding board with that in mind. And so Run Gen Z and its co-founders is Joe, myself, and then we have two young ladies from Florida who are both state representatives, State Representative Amber Mariano, who was elected at 21, and State Representative Josie Tomkow, who was elected at 23. We also have State Representative Joe Alexander, who's very involved with the Log Cabin Republicans and the Young Republicans in New Hampshire. He was elected at 23. And then Caleb Hanna, who I mentioned earlier, is the youngest African-American elected to a state office in United States history, got elected at 18 to the West Virginia House of Delegates. And all of these people, once ethnically and just from their upbringing, are very diverse, but they're also, going back to what I was talking about earlier, very diverse in their ideology and where they fall on the political spectrum. And so I think that that's definitely a focus of ours at Run Gen Z is to make sure that we're kind of breaking past this stereotype of the Republican Party that we're all a bunch of old white guys. I mean, I've got a lot of gray hairs for a 26-year-old, but I certainly don't think I'm old yet. So,
Yeah, I think that's fair and very important. And I also wanted to note that in the article that I had read, you guys also seem to throw some support behind a similar organizations that do the same thing, but on the left side of the political aisle. So isn't it so obviously you guys are a conservative organization and you want the best for the conservative movement and the Republican Party in general. But do you think it's important that regardless of the party, what's bigger is that you're getting more young people involved and people from different backgrounds, regardless of party, and there are organizations that do the same thing just on the other side.
Absolutely. I think that, I mean, obviously Run Gen Z, we're kind of two-pronged, right? We want to empower young people, but we want to also move the conservative movement forward. And going back to something we talked about a minute ago, I'm not somebody that's going to turn away competition on the left. So bring it on.
Fair, fair. Steve, do you have any other questions? But unfortunately, we are wrapping up. Gonna have to wrap up soon. We're running out of time. But
Yeah. I mean, sort of a shifting gear. For me, I want to take it as an opportunity to kind of just talk about how I view the organization after all this information. I really admire how grassroots everything that you guys are and for feels. My initial jump when I think about grassroots, I don't know if you've ever seen it, the documentary that Cory Booker filmed when he was running for mayor of Newark called Street Fight. There's a scene where he's literally walking the streets of Newark at night and he's yelling up to these high rises and he's pitching to these people, you know, his platform. And that's always the image I've had in my head of like grassroots, somebody on the ground doing the work. And I think what your organization represents and organizations like Run Gen Z is kind of a new understanding of what grassroots is. By developing a network, you guys facilitate a larger community of other grassroots organizers that are doing the same work. And I think that's really powerful. And it's a great asset for this generation as we begin to kind of make that transition in politics. So less of a question and more of a hats off, and I'm excited to see exactly how Run Gen Z and organizations like Run Gen Z kind of push their respective movements forward, because I think that we're at an interesting point in politics for young people, and I'm very excited to know that there's people out here like you guys doing this kind of work.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate the sentiment, Stephen. And next time we talk, I'll keep pitching you on the limited government and keeping more money.
So we're gonna wrap up, but I got one more question before we ask our final question, which is the hardest question you'll ask the entire interview. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you this. Obviously, this show is with the Jersey First TV network, so New Jersey is a big part of it. So my question is, I'm wondering if I were to come to you and said, Mason, I'm thinking about running in the state of New Jersey. What is your first thought? Obviously, it's a blue state. It's going to be harder to win as a Republican. And second of all, just what when somebody says New Jersey to you, what's the first thought that comes in your head there?
So I was thinking about this before we hopped on, and so two things that kind of popped into my head was one, we actually had a state assembly candidate in New Jersey last cycle that we supported through the mentorship. His name is Vinny Panico, and he came very close, within a couple percentage points of flipping a blue seat red. And so it would have been one Democrat, one Republican, with the way you guys have your district set up there as the legislative spots. But Vinny, I mean, he's about 29 years old, and he's actually running for town council now. When he first approached me, I was like, I didn't know there were Republicans in New Jersey, right? And then we're watching the Virginia governor election on election night last year. And all of a sudden, it's like, you see the bottom of the screen and it's like, oh man, like New Jersey's kind of close. Who expected that? And so I think New Jersey is a bit different today. And you guys would know this better than I do, than it was even say in 2020. I think a lot has changed, and there's a lot of moving parts, and that's not unique to New Jersey either. We're seeing it across the country. And one of the big parts of our process is putting together research for our applicants to figure out what a viable race is for them. And I found it interesting looking at small towns, big urban centers across the country, and we'll put the election results for the last 8 to 10 years together, and we'll just kind of see what the trends have been. And obviously, and most of the times, you'll see either a big red swing or a big blue swing in 2016. Then you'll see either an even bigger swing in that direction in 2018. And then 2020, it's kind of a toss-up to see what happened. But these trends, they exist all over the country. And so I think I kind of dodged your question there unintentionally, but New Jersey is certainly a state that we're very interested in having a presence in. And as I mentioned earlier, I'll be at the A Seat at the Table conference next week, speaking on a panel with my deputy director, so that we can foster more connections in New Jersey, make sure that we're leaving our footprint there.
Yeah, and before Stephen jumps in with that question that I warned you about here, obviously while you're in New Jersey, make sure you make your way down to the Seaside Heights Boardwalk. You can maybe meet Stephen in person and get one of those frozen custard cones that I was telling you about before we started interviewing. It's the best ice cream you'll ever have.
I will.
Stephen, all you.
Yeah, he's not lying. The ice cream is delicious. So last question, it's kind of our staple question. And I really got a feeling regionally that you're going to give me the right answer here. But we're in New Jersey. We're two Jersey boys. This is Jersey first and Jersey through and through. So let's say you're taking a road trip, hypothetically, Dallas to Jersey, right? The flight's canceled. You got to drive. You want to get in the Jersey spirit. Are you throwing on Bruce Springsteen or Bon Jovi?
Oh, Bruce Springsteen, easy choice.
My man.
So you did help out Stephen there at the end. I think you might have solidified your place in Steve's heart with that answer.
You might be seeing an application.
Can we get you to run for city council, Stephen?
Absolutely.
He'll get you to run, but you're gonna have to flip the party on that one, right?
Yeah, we'll work on that. Yeah.
All right, Mason, thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure talking to you about Run Gen Z, about your own personal story. It was really awesome. I think that, I mean, we've said it throughout the entirety of the interview. It's just remarkable what you guys have been able to do. So thank you for joining us. We really do appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thank you guys. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to get the chance to meet you guys in person when we're up in New Jersey at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Real quick, where can people find you guys on social media, website, and you personally?
Absolutely. So the Run Gen Z is the website's just rungenz.com. Twitter and Facebook is at rungenz. And then our Instagram is at run.genz. And my personal handle on Twitter, I think it's Mason Morgan 14. If you guys want to follow me, I mostly just retweet Run Gen Z stuff though. So I'd recommend following those accounts.
That's fair. So thank you everybody for tuning into another episode of Bridging the Gap here on the Jersey First TV network. This was obviously with Mason Morgan of Run Gen Z. And without leaving you even longer, my name is AJ Malillo.
I am Stephen Rambola.
And I hope you have a wonderful week. We'll catch you next week. Thank you.